Why take a particular interest with the uncanny today? Freud made the uncanny famous in his 1919 essay by that name, exploring the eeriness of dolls and waxworks. But for a century, it remained a professional term, used in a few very specific disciplines: psychology, sociology, literature and cinema, robotics and animation. It seldom made it into idle conversation. Nowadays, everyone, everywhere, whether knowingly or not, is talking about it. The uncanny is all around us, in our haunted homes, beaming from our screens, and the ghostly streets of our transformed cities. It's in the fabric of everyday life, in the sudden strangeness of daily routines. A fear not from a clearly defined and well-known unknown, but from the ordinary, the well-trod, the familiar, the self. A fear not triggered by alienation, not external, a fear coming from inside the house. None of us are strangers to the disruption of daily life. Wars, terror attacks, nuclear accidents, oil spills, and natural disasters afflict every region, strain economies, damage cities, injure homes and families. But we're still far from a complete understanding of the exceptionality of the COVID-19 event in history, being both on a global scale but also extremely intimate. At a particular moment in 2020, billions of people all over the world experienced a complete upheaval of their lives and routines as they were asked, sometimes required, to quarantine in their home, to shelter in place. This, surprisingly, did not coincide with reports from the front lines, at least not as we were used to them. Hospital Wing C isn't exactly the Somme, Iwo Jima, or New York City on 9/11. There were no reports from the engineering teams at the nuclear accidents or from the rescue efforts at the tsunami-hit coastal region. The shock includes the disruption of perspective. We now receive periodic reports from the Ministry of Education about the opening and closing of kindergartens and schools. There are heated debates on the news about visits to mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, and how to celebrate Passover Seder, Thanksgiving, or Christmas. And there's also the many smaller, personal dilemmas. Do I hug the friend who went through a painful breakup, or the one who just found out she has cancer? We all went through, are still going through, a difficult and strange process of alienation from what we know, perceive, identify as familiar, as ourselves. We were not drafted for military reserve duty, did not need to flee our own homes. On the contrary, we were not refugees, nor were we in the trenches. Our trenches were the city streets and boulevards. The battlefield was on Zoom. A lull in the fight was a step from the bedroom to the living room. A return from the front line was a drive from home to work. We also had no idea if and which of these disruptions are temporary or permanent, and if these life changes are good or bad, which makes them even harder to address, to process, to understand how we feel about them. How do we talk about all of this? What's the story we tell? How do we integrate the past year into our vision of our futures? All of this, along with the political shocks, social, economic, and health distress, have generated in many an increased anxiety, an anxiety that has brought the uncanny to our mental doorstep and to the front and center of the psychological, social, and cultural stages. Might the uncanny be the new dominant fear in the soon-to-be new normal time? Not fear of an unknown other, but fear of an unknowable self. This is why at Utopia we decided to take a long, hard look at the uncanny and explore it in our second edition. In my article, I delve into the heart of the in vogue internet conspiracy QAnon and suggest that uncanny fears are a main motivating factor in its acceptance and propagation. And of course, there are a few science fiction recommendations to try out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't be afraid.
What seems more obvious than our homes? Our home is the place we go to be ourselves, by ourselves. And yet, COVID-19 has shown us that the home, like everything else around us, can also be strange, contain otherness, be multifaceted. Springing from our new uncanny habitats, we find potential. How can this current, ongoing, and scarring disruption of the most obvious and intimate of spaces help us disrupt other obvious patterns in our lives and challenge the political status quo? The obvious is always the land of the powerful. To them, to those of us privileged enough to be counted among their number, most of our world is invisible. Whether we're talking about physical limitations, like borders or police blockades, or social limitations, like money or moral norms, the privileged glide through the world, and that ease of movement is thought of as obvious. Of course I can walk the streets of my city without fear of being harassed by police. Of course I can buy the basic necessities I need to live and more. Of course I can fly to a different country and cross borders. Of course I live in a house. Of course I have a home. What is more obvious, more invisible, more taken for granted to those who have it, than the very existence of a place to call your own? And yet, the COVID-19 and the Right to Housing report, submitted to the 75th UN General Assembly, identifies 1.8 billion people who didn't have sufficient housing to take shelter in during the pandemic, at least so far. Those are 1.8 billion people who, by force of their very visible, very non-obvious circumstances, could not lock down. They couldn't just stay home. To them, the lack of a proper house is a lot realer than our actually existing homes. Their lack of a home exerts more felt influence on their lives, has more impact on what they can and can't do than our own existing houses. This, as you might already be feeling, is quite weird. We might even say that the fact that our physical existing houses are less real than a non-existent house is uncanny. That uncanny feeling, the Unheimliche, arises when the familiar and the unfamiliar mix, when our expectations are appended, when the obvious is suddenly made less obvious. This is clear enough in this case. All of us, whether through fiction or by taking the wrong turn down a street we thought we knew, or seeing the inside of our apartments in the middle of the night, have encountered the uncanny. But what I'd like to propose to you, what might not be so obvious, is that the uncanny is an opportunity. By its very nature, the weird, the unreal, the bizarre, the uncanny, all challenge the obvious. And, by extension, they all challenge power. At their core, these genres or themes or sensations ask one question: what if the way things are now were different? What if the things we most take for granted were to suddenly change? What would remain that was important? And what, if anything, would we like to remove or keep? For both the 1.8 billion people without proper housing and for those of us with proper housing, the pandemic is an opportunity to really see our surroundings for what they are: the sites of privilege, normalcy, and power. Our homes were irrevocably changed by the pandemic, but we shouldn't strive to go back to normal. We should push further, using the uncanny thrust created by the pandemic to cut to the core of what houses are and to ask ourselves the hard questions on what they can and should be.
It's winter 2020. I asked the pharmacist about a pack of vitamin D to somewhat relieve my winter depression. Both our faces are covered by COVID masks. I do not speak the local language, and I guess she cannot even notice that I'm speaking English. She does not understand what I'm saying. I do not understand her reply. I try to joke about it, and I have no idea if she's getting the joke, if she even knows that I'm joking. Are you smiling at me, or are you scowling? I pay, walk out to the street. My breath gets trapped inside the mask, blowing up and out to my cheeks. I walk out to the street on a cold winter day, and immediately my glasses are filled with steam. When I was younger, I protected myself from the world by opting to wear thick-rimmed glasses. But now that I'm older and more confident, wishing to open myself to the world, I choose lighter frames. And then comes the mask and covers my eyes completely. I walk carefully outside, breathing slower to minimize the effect. I'm on a long trip, been in public transit for a few hours now, the mask always on. I can smell my own breath. The scent is amplified by the surgical mask, filling my nostrils. There is nothing normal about this, an aspect of myself I usually never notice. Like being in a room made of mirrors, like seeing myself from behind. I should have taken a fabric mask. In Vipassana meditation, they teach you that the road to insight passes in attention, and attention grows from observing actions you would usually do in a state of distraction. Your most basic bodily function, breathing, must be done without attention. How could you even live with intentional breathing? So you start there. Vipassana begins by defamiliarizing breathing itself. Perhaps it is no way to live with uncanny breathing, but uncanny breathing is an effective gateway to meditation. It's all coming back to me with the mask on. I feel each breath in all my senses, the heat and the steam, the taste and the smell, the sound of myself echoing between fabric and skin. They say that in the age of COVID, it is more crucial than ever to master the smize. Smize is a shorthand for smiling with your eyes, as coined by Tyra Banks in 2009. I am far from mastering the smize. I have no technique. I try, but I just look slightly angrier. When I actually smile, my eyes become narrow slits. Now, with my mouth and nose covered, every smile is an almost complete closure of my face. You couldn't tell whether I'm smiling or scowling.
It's been a long year at home, sweet home. Long hours indoors. In the year of lockdown, the place you come back to turned the place you rarely leave. No longer the opposite of street, school, work. The residence is overpopulated with emails, Zooms, and living room Zumbas. You're no longer private domain, where you are live. You're logged on, you're connected, you're muted. It's semantic satiation. Repeat a phrase long enough and it loses its meaning. Uncanny, 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 uncanny. Stay in the same space long enough and it stops being a refuge. Stay in a space long enough to realize you're not alone in it. Your creaking floor, your moaning neighbor, his kids, a glooming presence of your landlord, Your home is not yours. There is opportunity in the daily furniture. Take the familiar environment apart to reveal the potential spaces and images in it. Resist in your living room. Resist. The home environment is the setting for Traum live installation. The finite residential space is challenged using daily objects, lights, mirrors, a plant, ladder, candles, moving curtains. The wall is endless. The hallway is the final frontier. Remember the world that continues to exist and move despite the feeling of confinement, outside and inside the home environment. Traum live installation is an architectural resistance. It challenges the boundaries of a finite space. It was born out of the first lockdown in Berlin and performed live for Viral Festival in April 2020.
In his lecture series, Society Must Be Defended, Michel Foucault argued that at the end of the 18th century, European society changed its main method of control, from sovereignty to biopower. Sovereignty was based on the power of death, manifested by the state's ability to take away things: money, organs, lives. Biopower, in contrast, controls by organizing life, gathering statistics on birth, death, diet, and hygiene, planning the public space, optimizing. This method of control, which perseveres to this day, suggests to us several ways of living, which are convenient for the current array of power. Those of us who do not challenge this choice and are not othered by society for any other reason are privileged to be, quote-unquote, regular people. One can live like that and almost never feel that they are being governed, like riding a train without considering the tracks. COVID pushed the train off the tracks, forcing everyone to drastically change their way of life, and exposing the tracks for what they were. But what failed to arrive is a new set of behaviors which will realign us with the desires of power. Where is the new normal? Why are we still living an uncanny life? One reason has to do with neoliberalism. Specifically, the idea, common since the era of Reagan and Thatcher, that society is best organized by markets, and government's role is only to make sure that everyone plays by the rules. Culturally, neoliberalism comes with a certain self-perception. We are, as Thatcher argued, individuals or families. We work to make money, we spend it on what we need, and we stay out of the affairs of others. If our income is higher than our expenditure, we should never want for anything. Those are the train tracks, and that's the idea of a smooth ride. Crises, such as COVID or any recession, disturb this way of life. We try to do what we've normally done, but suddenly there are no jobs, or the jobs don't provide enough income, or things are too expensive, or the markets are empty. But an epidemic is unique in that it is resistant to individual actions. Israelis found this out after our first quarantine. Individuals quarantined themselves, and the epidemic was scaled back to incredibly low numbers. But when the quarantine was lifted, what we needed was coordinated action to reopen safely. In this, our government failed spectacularly, and the epidemic soon raged at pre-quarantine numbers. Under the neoliberal politics we've grown accustomed to, such a crisis, one that requires governmental coordination, simply shouldn't exist. That is why the political element of COVID is uncanny, because it was not supposed to exist. A great many people have entrenched in them the belief that politics does not apply to them. They were riding on an invisible train and could not see the tracks. Suddenly the big beast that is controlling, enabling, exploiting, and aiding their lives is painfully obvious. Can we expect the uncanny presence of politics to disappear after enough shots have been put in arms? There are several reasons to think not. First, COVID is inseparable from the growing ecological crisis. With urban sprawl meeting shrinking natural habitats, we are due for more zoonotic viruses in the future. As Naomi Klein argues in This Changes Everything, climate change, like COVID, is felt more by oppressed populations and cannot be resolved by free markets. Second, a boom-bust cycle is inherent to capitalism. Like the dot-com bubble and the subprime crisis, we can expect to have our lives shaken every decade or so. And be sure that in the next crisis, the political tendencies developed during COVID will be felt. But perhaps more important is the fact that our desire to go back to normal is a conservative impulse that stands in the way of imagining new realities. As Octavia Butler wrote, the only lasting truth is change. There will never be a quiet time when we can go back to how we were. So our response to the uncanny cannot be rejection. We cannot wait for it to disappear. We can't get back home by ignoring the road we've already taken. We can only get home by continuously making the road our home. It is a process without an instruction set, a response to a train going off the rails. We cannot stop it, but we can harness the power that drives it and try to take it somewhere better than it is heading right now.